What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Infrastructure Week. I am re-recording this session because I did not hit the record button on Monday, so it's a good way to conclude Infrastructure Week by going back to the start. I want to welcome everybody here to this video and thank all of our presenters over the course of the week. It was a really cool experience bringing everybody together, hearing about their projects, and really getting these ideas of collaboration and engagement reinforced through these projects. So, quick summary of Infrastructure Week. I am Robert Hanlon with Utility². I put on the Seattle rendition. This is part of a much larger movement known for United for Infrastructure. They're based out of Washington, D.C., formed in 2013, and they now consist of over 500 cross-sector affiliates aimed every year getting together to drive investment, highlight opportunities, and really make the case for spending more engagement and awareness into our infrastructure. So first and foremost, Infrastructure Week serves as a platform for awareness of and engagement into our city's infrastructure, its present state, function, projects, initiatives, and of course, the opportunities. It represents a collaborative movement between public, private, and nonprofit organizations to build more sustainable, if not regenerative, infrastructure and accelerate equitable development strategies for urbanized communities. Before we go any further, we must acknowledge that there's a war on environmental regulations that's risking our ecological preservation. And now with the recent surge of pressure to get the economy back in order, I urge us to all take this pause and take advantage of shelter in place to understand our impact and begin a better normal, one that does not require policy to make ethical decisions surrounding development, energy, and of course our economy. It's up to us to see a sustainable evolution of society realized, designers to enable regenerative designs, engineers to create novel solutions, and our community acting as conscious consumers and infrastructure advocates, and our local politicians communicating with and working for the people. And in order for us to proceed any further and really have this idea of equitable development and sustainable development, we must start by acknowledging our history and the fact that we are gathered on the unceded land of indigenous peoples. These lands were claimed and redeveloped into their present shape by foreign colonizers through documented exclusions and erasures of many indigenous peoples, as well as their cultures. As you can see from this map, there's many different communities living in the present day state of Washington. In Seattle, which was founded in 1852, although we know that people were here in the thousands long before it became Seattle. It was one of the most engineered cities in the country, if not the world. On the left, we can see the city and a present overlay of what it was like in 1875. You can see the coastline, where it was mainly wetlands and marsh, prime fishing and hunting ground for indigenous peoples. However, if we look to the right, a map from 1906, in just 31 years, you can start to see how we had come in and started developing the land, make ways for ships to land and ports. And really, as we move further into the 20th century, we saw this land quickly changing, especially with projects like the Denny regrade in 1901. So one of these sites is the former Port of Seattle Terminal T107, which is now a park. It's just one of these places, a former coastal village site for the Duwamish that was acquired for industrial development in the 60s. It was eventually determined to be of cultural significance through excavations and finding artifacts, and the project was abandoned. Decades later, restoration work has continually been completed since the mid-1990s by the port under their ownership. And now the park remains a window into Seattle's history. So I ask that everyone acknowledges this truth, respecting present and future cultural preservation of the indigenous Duwamish and Coast Salish communities that are local to where I'm putting this on here in Ballard, and hold space in your thoughts for the countless cultures and earthly wisdom lost through legacies of colonialism. We must embody the lessons of history in our efforts to build a better future. We as consumers and a global leader must seek to end the continued exploitation of indigenous peoples and their environment. I believe that we can use infrastructure as a platform to do so. So, getting into infrastructure, I do feel it's important to reflect and understand what is all entailed. You can see the definition there that really lays the foundation for what it all is. One of the most common things I was asked when reaching out and getting organizations on board with this movement to present is, well, we aren't really affiliated with infrastructure, so why are you reaching out to us? And so I had to kind of do some second guessing and ask, well, are they? And, it comes to show that there is a very large net cast over what is infrastructure, starting with the basic primary components. These include our roads, our rail, ports, and utilities. What I'll coin the term is municipal utility services and infrastructure, MUSI. And of course, the governance managing them. Things like Seattle Public Utilities, Seattle City Light, or even King County, right? It's the things necessary for the operation of a society or enterprise. So we have city infrastructure, we have corporate infrastructure, it goes deep. Now, we also have these secondary elements. Without these, there would not be a big need for the first. Think of these as the people in our community, our buildings, apartments, sports, music venues, and even houses. And my most important one that I consider is green spaces, our parks and recreation, keeping nature in the urbanized environment. And thirdly, we have things that mostly designers and engineers really need to take into account. These impactful features like geological and environmental constraints. Here in Seattle, we see our shoreline, river, forest, and especially a challenging climate when it comes to building. Even along the West Coast, we have to deal with seismic considerations. So again, that kind of literally shapes the type of buildings that we can do and the codes we have to abide by. We also have to consider our local culture. We have to preserve the history and take a look at the overall city feel. And we don't want to put something that's necessarily out of place unless it's for improvement, and take a look at our economic conditions of our past, present, and future industry. And so people ask, well, why are we here? Why do we want to be engaged? Why should we care about infrastructure? Well, while increased public engagement can be a challenge for developers and designers, these infrastructure projects often take maybe a couple years, maybe a decade to complete, but they will shape the city for generations to come. We have to think of this infrastructure legacy. Look at the changes that the I-99 replacement with the viaduct is going to do for the waterfront, the business changes, just the overall walkability of this area. So if we think even more so with development of high rises and apartments, if those aren't done to suit the community's needs, then the community's stuck with them for years and years, because once you build something, it's much more expensive to tear it down and rebuild or even retrofit. So the key word is infrastructure legacy. And of course, I want to take this moment, now that we understand what infrastructure is, to thank the MUSI workforce, especially in times of COVID-19, shelter in place. We have to think how easy it is to turn on our faucet, flush our toilet, or really just take our trash outside and it'll be removed. So thank you for keeping the water flowing, our poop flushing, the electricity charging, the signals beaming, the food growing, the services serving, and their city functioning without the trash piling. The Seattle community is ever so gracious, as are people living in cities everywhere. The next term I want to bring in is this idea of modernity. You'll hear me bring it up quite a bit. It's a word that is, kind of the crux of a lot of these ideas we talk about. It gained popularity in the book Behemoth by Joshua Freeman, discussing the advent of mass production and the rise of factories. Essentially a dynamic concept of comparative socioeconomic status and a desire to remain at the forefront of progression. It's a process of questioning our present state and seeking improvement to what is considered modern. So what is modern? To do that, we have to give a quick history lesson here into what I like to use is the human era, the idea that Humans have been around for a long time, and using the Gregorian calendar, we're really only capturing the last 2020 years of it. So by adding on that 10,000 years of unrecognized history, we can really see how far we've come. Year zero, you may ask, that begins with the real first infrastructure we found, right? The first proof that humans were living in a city or a permanent dwelling. Before this, we were mostly a nomadic society, nomadic cultures. There were no permanent dwellings, at least any that were found or dated prior. During this time, the Ice Age was receding, and essentially, humanity endured the elements. So I'm going to start here as a quick timeline. Every 5 seconds represents 1,000 years. I'll try to keep up, but you'll see how quickly things move as we kind of turn into the last 2,000 years. So year zero marks the first discovered infrastructure, along with early stone tools, evidence of farming as the Ice Age recedes. Over the next 3,000 years, we saw evidence of trade found with widespread pottery and other developments. Our world population was about 5 billion. Around this time, the agricultural revolution brought forth the Bronze Age, additional populations, early writings, the wheel, and advanced metalwork. Now, trade was commonplace. Things started to move, and around this time is when many monotheist religions believed the world was created. Many notable high cultures were also formed around this world in this time, bringing forth a population around 30 million in the first generation of infrastructure in our cities. However, most of these societies vanished in what was known as the Great Disappearance, a huge loss of culture, followed by the rise of the Egyptian kingdom, fall of the Persian Empire, rise and fall of Rome, bringing a population around 300 million. The Dark Ages saw about 100 million lost in the Black Death, with the Renaissance and Gen 1.5 infrastructure. You see, I'm already behind. It's crazy how quickly we've come into the present. And things really transformed once Europeans reached the Americas. Now what we call colonization, and we'll later see just kind of the cost of what that came with. New horizons has emerged as our populations grew rapidly into the 19th century, becoming urbanized and bringing in our Generation 2.0 infrastructure, demanding increased external resources. This ultimately leads to our largest conflicts, World War I and World War II, and a lot of the problems we face today. And the point of this is to recognize our recent exponential growth, right? You can see our blue line, this anecdotal assessment of human progression, really exponential in the last 2,000 to 3,000 years. So the other things we want to look at here aren't just progression, right? We want to see what we've done. Things like, let's watch our human culture over the time. And so we could see, human culture had its growth. We saw a tremendous rise in our culture with a collapse within the Great Disappearance. And things kind of started to rise again as humans spread across the globe. But again, with Europe reaching the Americas, we saw a vast dominance of westernized culture sweep through and lead to the decline in culture. Now, in the present, we have a chance to kind of rework this curve. We can incentivize, or if not encourage, cultural empowerment to bring these back in our schools and teach the wisdom that has otherwise been lost or forgotten. We can incorporate our indigenous cultures into the modern concept. The other thing we want to look at is ecological health. Now, as the Ice Age recedes, we have seen a transformation in many of these areas that were on that fringe of the glacier extent. Things relatively held, roughly the same over most of the human era. And it wasn't until the last 100 to 200 years that we've seen a rapid decline in biodiversity, ecological health. The UN states that about 70% of natural wetlands have been lost in the last 100 years. That leaves us with only 30% of one of the most important natural features the Earth has for us. And again, something that's really crazy. 30 years ago, the International Panel on Climate Change issued their first report. And a year later, the World Wide Web comes into play, forever reshaping humanity. and a population of 7.71 billion. Something really cool to follow here, and it's not on this chart, but the Human Development Index, HDI, created by the UN to emphasize that people and their capabilities should not be the ultimate criteria for assessing the development of a country. So it takes in a lot of very statistical measurable quantities in different countries and comes up with this HDI number. I'll throw a link up there, something really cool to talk about. Now, this idea of modernity again, how did we get here? How did we arrive watching YouTube, giving virtual webinars? There's been a lot of change in the last 120 years. The late 19th century really carried about all of these change, coined this concept of modernity, and brought forth a radical shift towards innovation and human will. However, it was a provocative shift at the time, from decentralized creations by artisans to now factory-produced goods, spawning the emergence of cities on a scale never before seen. A statistic that I think really helps explain just how quickly this happened is the worldwide length of railroads in 1840 was about 4,500 miles. By 1860, that number had grown to 66,000 miles, and by 1880, it was over 228,000 miles. We could thank the Bessemer process for steel during the 1850s, but really, this growth was exponential. And the Eiffel Tower, completed in 1889 for the World's Fair, was over twice the height of the Washington Monument. It provided a sight only previously seen by balloonists and a few daring souls. Really putting humanity out there to question, what are our confines and what are the horizons? So as people flocked to the cities to experience modernity, the epidemic of disease was not far behind, right? We had the Black Plague, bubonic plague in the past. Well, we also had new diseases. To combat this epidemic, we had the advent of music. Generation 2, just significant process improvements and using these new materials to build out our infrastructure, starting with our water and wastewater treatment. We had flushing toilets invented, or the early groundwork invented by a plumber named Thomas Crapper. This technology was really perfected with the Sloan flushometer. And, with the adoption of flushing toilets came the need for wastewater treatment, which really wasn't until the late 19th century, but honestly, until the activated sludge process in 1912, not much was being done. Now, once we introduced chlorination into our potable water, we saw rates of cholera drop significantly. However, real regulations with teeth, as I like to say, were overdue. We didn't have the Clean Water Act until 1972, and the Safe Drinking Water Act wasn't until 1974. Almost a full century after cities were really becoming large and developed. It wasn't just water. Municipal solid waste was becoming a mounting problem as well. And you can see that the first modern landfill wasn't until 1935 in California. Really, up until early 20th century, animals were the primary means of disposal. The first collection services weren't until the 1900s, mostly just removing outside of the city, incinerating it in the city, using it for infill, and dumping a lot of it into open bodies of water, a practice that wasn't banned until 1988, and the regulations weren't actually effective until 1991. That's pretty wild. Now, wars saw our first recycling programs, our guidelines kind of being developed in the 1930s, and it wasn't until the Solid Waste Disposal Act of 1965 that real guidelines were put in place. So you see here an early pamphlet for a sanitary unit or an odd house. And again, some of the really cool brochures that were passed to people that were not overseas fighting the war to encourage recycling so that we can capture those valuable materials. Now, the other big component here is electricity. I like to consider this the new wheel. It really brought us into a new generation. Starting with the war of currents, AC versus DC. Both of them won out, it turns out. So the more important concepts here that we've developed is this idea of a natural monopoly. A large investment in infrastructure is difficult to do by many stakeholders, so it's usually just one company that gets it. An idea of investor-owned utilities versus publicly owned utilities, a very complex thing that we are still dealing with today. All of these things kind of came to head with Enron in 2001, where corporation essentially became more powerful through the acquisition of many electrical generators and transmitters, became more powerful than the governance surrounding them. Ultimately, the whole thing kind of collapsed in on itself, but it made us question, what do we do about infrastructure that is critical? Is it in the hands of a privately held corporation, or should it be a publicly owned corporation? Now, a lot of the management behind the transmission and generation was set up by the North American Energy Reliability Council in 1968. It's now a corporation, but same purpose. So really, as we come into the present, we have this generation 2.0 plus, right? So modernity is essentially having this infrastructure. You think of it as our simple conveniences, really, the things that all of us have access to in our houses and the things that keep our cities clean and functioning. But we have to remember that a lot of this growth that we've had over the last 100 years has had a cost to our environment and to a lot of developing countries. If you think about it, we've all started the same way. We have these steps, a linear approach to development, or at least that's been what's historically happening. But we really need to consider this when we think about where our products come from, or at least where raw materials to produce them. And we may no longer consider them to be cheap and affordable. We might not have the same idea of convenience. One of the things we need to consider is some of the agriculture products that we get here are cheap to us, but we're actually relying on developing countries to export a significant portion of their product so that we can have those cheap fruits and nuts and things like that. And, next time you see a great deal on imported beef, it may not be the same deal if you consider the loss in biodiversity through slash and burn. So again, let's just kind of think, this history of capitalism and the same linear development path has not been kind to Earth, nor billions of its inhabitants. Humans are not alone on this planet in being affected. So we may want to reconsider spreading its playbook around the world and rethink this approach. And remember, the consumer drives the market, but marketing does drive the consumer. So we all kind of need to step back from this vicious cycle, take a pause, like I said earlier, and understand what consumerism is really doing to the Earth. And again, it's one Earth. It's really a problem that we all will face together. We're facing it now together, and future generations will also be facing it to a greater extent. Whether it's increased resource demand as other countries become into this developed consumerism-based economy, but battling the awareness of sustainability. With all the science and facts around anthropogenic climate change, it took a pandemic to reduce CO2 emissions by the largest margin since the Great Depression, albeit it's only about 8% temporary reduction. We just have to think, right? And of course, this idea of climate change and, more importantly, ocean acidification, there are widespreading consequences. It doesn't matter if you're in the middle of the United States. Sea level rise may not affect you directly, but the consequences will. The price of produce is ultimately going to go up. Looking at reduced land availability and resource availability, it's a problem that we can no longer ignore. If we use statistics to take a look, any of these black areas, even the dark gray, represents a watershed that's overexploited. That is, the amount of water we are pulling from the ground cannot be readily replaced by that natural processes. So as cities have grown, so has our impact on groundwater reserves, which is our most precious resource. And in the United States, we have to look and understand our privilege, our water consumption, taking into account agriculture and all of the usage, is an order of magnitude plus of what is considered the minimum amount we need. And if we compare ourselves to many of our European counterparts, we're, again, 5 times the amount. So this just shows how much water we have, what the advantages and how much products we can create with that water. In terms of electricity and climate change, possibly one of the biggest relationships here is a lot of people like to blame India and China, but we need to look on ourselves here. We need to see how much energy we are using in the household and compare to see that against the European Union, we're almost 4 times as we are to the world average. And the only countries that come close to us are those that are in non-temperate climates. Right here in the US, we are in a temperate zone. But these other 6, 7 countries, they are in environmental extremes, very hot, like in the Middle East, or very cold, like Canada and Greenland, these areas that need electricity for heating. And again, look at China. We are almost an order of magnitude greater than the average household use in China. And of course, this is not expected to go down as more countries become developed. Energy consumption is expected to increase by 50% by 2050 for the EIA. That's an impressive number given what we already consume. So we need to look at what this portfolio of energy production is. And of course, one of the leading contributors to climate change is, in fact, the consumption of industrial scale meat. And as we see more countries come into this developed status, they want to mimic the things of developed countries, which is meat consumption. So again, just something to be conscious of, switching diets to be more vegetarian and less meat intensive, something that I've been trying to do for the last several years. Now, one good thing that we've seen here in the US is kind of the leveling off of municipal solid waste generation. We have a little bit of a shift going on, though, in delivery services, right? The click and buy approach, which ultimately leads to more packaging and has the risk to send us in the wrong direction. So we just need to be careful, make sure we are conscious of the products we buy. And more importantly, when it comes to disposal, we're following our service providers' guidance when it comes to landfill, compost, and hopefully single or multi-stream recycling. A good way to kind of think about all of these concepts is this idea of life cycle thinking and waste hierarchy triangle. It's really a simple tool that can change our behaviors as a species. And use this to see, right, at the very top is waste avoidance and reduction. It's a very tough goal to get to based on our present habits, but you can see Europe is well on their way, whereas most of the United States is still just sticking with landfill and getting rid of our waste by burying it. But we really need to push for recycling and composting programs and reclaim this lost energy. Starting with just changing our behaviors at home. One of my favorites is freezing unused vegetables to make delicious stock and eventually homemade tortilla soup. It's great. But let's just try to minimize consumerism and experience some other things, right? We can try some new cultures through tourism, this concept of adventurism or volunteerism, or even understanding feminism a little bit better. We can look at urban farming or just spending some time in our community and seeing how we can help. Let's rethink convenience a little bit. Again, exercise community. Really stop relying on single-use products, especially plastic water bottles. And as I always say, if you're a coffee addict like myself, practice bringing a cup with you. It's one less thing that you have to throw away. So a lot of things have been thrown at you. So I like to encourage everybody to just slow down, right? We have this pause. It's been given to us. It's caused a lot of pain. It's caused a lot of thinking. So let's take advantage of it. Think about the last few months, what you've missed, what you've learned, and really what's most important. To me, it's our nature and preserving the remaining biodiversity that we have. This is a picture from Lake Atitlan in Guatemala, a place that has been very heavily impacted by human activity and tourism. What is this place going to look like in another 50, 500, 5,000 years of human activity? We need to take these steps now so that we don't have any further ecological degradation. We need to question imposing our concept of modern or economy onto developing societies in the same systemic way that we have developed. To be frank, an economy that's been based on exploitation of the working class, the environment, and overconsumption. So what is modern? Having more convenience or having less impact? So our mission shouldn't be to return to and maintain our present state of normalcy. It should be to find immediate ways to improve it. So again, let's hold this existential thought experiment on what the next phase of modernity should be. And think about the 12,020 years of the human era and what those next 50, 500, 5,000 years can look like. So again, any path forward must account for the successes and mistakes of history to be both sustainable and equitable. Now, this concept I brought up a couple times here is where are we heading? Well, like I said, we've been in generation 2.0, 2.0 plus for the last 100 years. We've had tremendous advances in other realms of industry, but we're still kind of behind. And what I see as being the next step is this generation 3 infrastructure, an interconnected city, symbiosis, this idea of symbio cities. A lot of European countries are starting to take this approach, leveraging different waste streams and utilizing them in very local processes. So you don't have that high cost of transporting, what some would consider waste. It's essentially this holistic and inclusive approach to sustainable urban development that transforms urban challenges into opportunities. So I will definitely have more on this in an upcoming vlog, so stay tuned, but definitely check out those links. So capturing all these ideas, right? Rethinking infrastructure and the importance of having public awareness and engagement, understanding that we can have probably the most progress through cross-sector collaboration. Rethinking convenience and its true cost using our reflective decisional system instead of our automatic. Reflective being that which is our intelligence, that which is critical thinking, automatic, kind of falling back on that marketing that's been given to us, very powerful marketing to develop our habits. And along those lines, let's rethink the power of individual actions and the power of community to reduce our impact. And along those lines is exactly what we are doing here at Utility², right? We are facilitating sustainable development strategies for MUSI, municipal utility services and infrastructure, as well as the communities they serve, through volunteering, connecting volunteers, collaborating with different organizations, and one of them putting on this event to communicate some of these cool projects that are being done within infrastructure and get some people involved, or hopefully connect people that may not know other endeavors exist. So our mission is to develop our infrastructure sustainably, help connect this generation 3 infrastructure while also working in the community to identify opportunities, to provide education, and really emphasize the importance of cultural resilience as we move into the future. So I definitely want to thank all of our awesome presenters that we had throughout this week. It's been a very cool experience, some really good questions, some really good discussion. We really heard about just how much green infrastructure and renewable technologies come with these ancillary benefits that we just don't hear about. We don't hear that solar energy can actually be built alongside some native plant restoration to create a green environment, or the fact that not only does composting and waste to energy programs create these viable products, but they also help reduce landfill and provide local opportunities. So again, with Infrastructure Week, we want to highlight the importance of community awareness and civic engagement. Otherwise, it'll just be a few strongly opinionated stakeholders making decisions for all of us. And we do know that some of the best ideas have rarely become reality without adequate support. Some of the worst ideas have been pushed through because of limited awareness and tamed engagement. So with that, I encourage you to check out the videos that we put together throughout the week. And if nothing else, find some ways to volunteer in your community, get a little bit involved, and follow those passions through to really bring us all together into a sustainable future. So I look forward to our future events and can't wait to see you guys at Infrastructure Week 2021.